Well, hello everybody. I'm doing the last part in the series of President Ronald Reagan. This information comes from the U.S. Mint website, and today is the release of the Reagan Coin and Chronicles set at 9 a.m. Pacific. So feel free to get one of those if you like. There's a large mintage of 150,000 and a family limit of 3. So, presidency and later life. The American dream lives not only in the hearts and minds of our own countrymen, but in the hearts and minds of millions of the world's people in both free and oppressed societies who look to us for leadership. As long as that dream lives, as long as we can continue to defend it, America has a future, and all mankind has reason to hope. Remarks from the annual Washington Conference at the American Legion in 1983. The birth of the Reagan era. Reagan's resounding victory in the 1980 presidential election signaled a new era for U.S. politics at home and overseas. When he took office in January 1981, the nation was steeped in an economic crisis. Public confidence in the U.S. government was at its lowest level since the Pew survey started measuring it in 1958. The stakes were high, and any misstep early on could be catastrophic for Reagan's post-election momentum. He knew he had to act quickly to deliver on the campaign promises to stabilize the economy and renew the nation's optimism. The Iran hostage crisis came to an end on January 20th, 1981, the same day that Reagan delivered his inaugural address. After 444 days in captivity, 52 Americans were released and repatriated to the U.S. amid great celebration and fanfare. Reagan's presidency began on a popular high note. The new president focused immediately on his economic plan, which emphasized budget cuts and tax reductions. He also aimed to reduce the size and influence of the federal government while boosting military spending. Shots fired. Barely 2 months after he was inaugurated, President Reagan was leaving the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington when gunshots broke out. Reagan was hit in the chest and immediately rushed to a nearby hospital where he was treated for punctured lung and serious internal bleeding. Despite the nearly fatal injury, Reagan's sense of humor remained intact. He famously joked to his surgeons, "Please tell me you're Republicans." 3 others, including President Secretary James Brady, were also shot and wounded in the attack. The shooter, John Hinckley Jr., was arrested at the scene and later found not guilty by reason of insanity. Reagan's Great Expansion. The great majority of the economic programs Reagan proposed at the onset of his presidency, including a 23% reduction in personal income taxes over a 3-year period, ultimately passed in Congress. While this initial legislative victory was important for the Reagan presidency, trouble lay ahead. In an attempt to combat inflation, the Federal Reserve had begun ratcheting up interest rates in 1979. Well before 1981 came to a close, the United States was steeped in a painful recession. Though members of his inner circle urged him to attempt to change the direction of the Federal Reserve, Reagan felt strongly that its policies would strengthen the American economy in the long run. Despite high unemployment and low gross national product, he insisted that the economy would rebound, and he was right. By 1983, the economy began to improve, and it continued to grow throughout the 80s. In fact, the expansion of the American economy between 1982 and 1989 was one of the largest sustained periods of economic growth in U.S. history. It's morning again in America. Though Reagan's approval ratings dipped significantly as a result of the 1981-82 recession, his favor rebounded along with the economy. By the time he ran for re-election in 1984, Americans were ready to embrace their leader again, campaigning with the slogan, "It's morning in America again." Reagan rode to a stunning victory over challenger Walter Mondale, carrying 49 of 50 states. President Reagan and Vice President George H.W. Bush settled in for 4 more years in the White House. Reagan had major plans for his second term as president. While the Great Expansion boosted the American economy, it also created massive budget deficits and caused the national debt to balloon. In 1985, he sought to raise revenue by proposing legislation to greatly simplify the tax code, close existing loopholes while lowering individual tax rates, and reduce the number of tax brackets. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 eventually passed and served as a hallmark of Reagan's domestic agenda. Peace through strength. With the American economy back on its feet, Reagan turned his focus to foreign policy, making good on his campaign promise to promote peace through strength. He increased the defense spending in inflation-adjusted dollars by 35% over the course of his 8 years in office. International terrorism was a growing problem, and Reagan sent a clear message that terrorist attacks targeting Americans would result in serious ramifications for those responsible. In 1986, 2 American servicemen were killed and dozens were injured in the bombing of a German nightclub. With confirmation that Libyan-backed terrorists were responsible for the attack, Reagan acted swiftly and decisively, ordering retaliatory airstrikes against Libyan targets. The Reagan Doctrine. President Reagan was deeply invested in restoring America's influence and prestige on the world stage. He believed that the spread of the communist and Marxist philosophies represented a formidable threat to the United States and democratic governments around the world, and was unafraid to lead the international campaign against them. The Reagan Doctrine, as it became known, was a policy of weakening the Soviet Union's influence by supporting anti-communist regimes in Central America, Asia, and Africa. Hoping to secure the release of U.S. hostages held in Lebanon and to aid the Contras in Nicaragua, members of the Reagan administration helped facilitate the sale of arms to Iran, which was at that time illegal because of an arms embargo. President Reagan created a special review board to investigate and provide its findings to the White House. After the board issued its report, he addressed the nation. First, let me say I take full responsibility for my own actions and for those of my administration. As angry as I may be about activities undertaken without my knowledge, I am still accountable for those activities. As disappointed as I may be in some who serve me, I'm still the one who must answer the American people for this behavior. In addition to taking responsibility, President Reagan outlined major changes to prevent something like this from happening again. He brought in new staff, ordered the National Security Council to review all covert operations and ensure compliance with American values, and adopted the board's recommendations on how the council process and staff should work. Russian diplomacy. Diplomatic relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had been virtually non-existent for decades. The Cold War had persisted since the end of World War II, and Soviet leaders continued to build nuclear weapons while remaining closed to negotiation with the U.S. and its North American Treaty Organization allies. Unlike several American presidents before him, Reagan refused to accept a defense with the Soviet Union. He believed that Unlike several American presidents before him, Reagan refused to accept a détente with the Soviet Union. He believed that by building up America's military, the United States could position itself to persuasively negotiate the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons reduction. And when progressive Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev ascended to power, Reagan seized the opportunity to meet with him. Over the course of several tense summit meetings in 1987 and 1988, Reagan and Gorbachev formed a diplomatic partnership, and in 1987, Reagan negotiated the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the first agreement since the beginning of the Cold War that removed intermediate nuclear weapons from Europe. Though the Cold War did not end until 1991, Reagan is widely credited for being instrumental in its cessation. Life after presidency. In 1989, after 2 historic terms as President and First Lady Ronald and Nancy Reagan returned to California. Exit polls indicated that Reagan had the highest approval rating of any departing president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Reagan wrote 2 post-presidency memoirs, Speaking My Mind and An American Life, in 1989 and 1990. In 1994, Reagan announced in a public letter that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. bravely drawing awareness to the health issue that some considered taboo. On June 5, 2004, with Nancy by his side, the 40th President of the United States passed away peacefully. That concludes the Reagan series brought to you by the U.S. Mint. Thank you for listening.